Hi, as part of your MBA program in your business school, you'll be expected to read lots of cases and are also expected to submit write ups for those cases. Here are some tips that I put together from my experience creating lots of those case write ups, but also grading lots of those case write ups. So, there are three levels of tips, and I'm going to go through each one of them. The very first, basics. The first set of basic tip is, submit on time. You will be dinged if you don't submit on time. Why leave this simple tip out, right? And do a spell check. I've seen so many submissions which have poor grammar and didn't use an inbuilt spell check. So use spell check program and make sure that your write up doesn't come across as something that has not even done basic level of checking. Write your team name and your batch name in the header with group names, team members, all of them who've submitted, or if it's part of a group, then you add your group names at the very top on the first page. And the most of the basic tip is avoid plagiarism, like searching from the internet, answers that are copy pasted from any other previous submissions. You are 100% likely to fail if you do the wrong things. So avoid wrong things. Basic. And these are like basic tips. Stick to the page limit. Not too much, not too less. If you write very little and don't go in depth, then that's bad as well. But if you write way beyond the page limit, then there is a problem of not being concise, crisp, and clear. So stick to around your page limit, ideally under the page limit, but not too less. If you're expected to write 5 pages and if you finish it in 1 page, then there's clearly a problem. But if you write 6 pages, there's also a problem. So 4 to 5 pages is what you should plan for. Stick to the limit. Third and the final basic tip is structure your answers in the question and answer format and use good headers for the answers that you use. So if there's a question that says, why is this industry profitable? Let's take an example. Then you may have 2 or 3 main points. So then use good headers for those points before you explain those points. So write those headers in bold and then explain those points with some backing. So structure it in question and answer format makes easy for someone who's reading it. Let's go to the intermediate tips. So I'll have 3 intermediate tips and I'll have eventually 3 advanced tips. So we've gone through 3 basic tips. What's the first intermediate tip? Write for your audience. So it connects to the third point here, which is you want to structure it in such a way that it's easier for your audience. In business school, you are writing for the grader and the GSI or the lecturer or the professor who's grading. That's your audience. So you need to know that they probably have 70 people in one class. Just take an example, and they might have 10 different classes, let's say. So that's like 700 people. So you want to write it for your audience. You want to give them the points that they need and make sure you understand the job that the audience is trying to get done, which is to give you points or deduct points. So what gets you points is what you need to get to quickly, and ask your lecturer, GSI, professor as to, what is it that they expect. Similarly, in a business setting, you will be writing for your leaders and you would want to know what is the format, what's the style, what's the best practice. So write for your audience. Very important. You can't just write for yourself or your team. You need to write for your audience and structure it and cater it. And so ideally you would want to have an office hour session, ask your GSI or your professor what do they expect in what format, and how can it be made easier for them, right? The second tip in intermediate, go straight to the key points. You don't need to repeat the case. You don't need to add context, introduction, and images. There are stock images that you don't need any of that. the question is, and the answer is, and why, right? So go straight to the key points. There's no need to repeat what everyone already knows. Again, cater this to the audience. And then the final tip is cases are used as a mechanism to get a real life concept embedded. So typically the professor would go through a framework. Let's say Porter's 5 forces is one such framework. And if you can use it in that case, and if it makes sense, let's say you're thinking about industry analysis, yeah, you want to use it. So basically use concepts and frameworks from the class. That's the whole purpose of making you go through this case. Sometimes it may be backwards that the structure and frameworks are introduced to you after the case. Well, in that case it's not possible, but most of the time you are exposed to those frameworks and concepts, and you would want to go through those reading material and use those as part of your case write-up. And make sure that you realize why it's done. It's done so that you learn certain frameworks and you can use it. That's the 3 intermediate tips. And let's go to the last section, which is 3 advanced level tips. The first one, in real life, you will always have pros and cons of various types of arguments that you can make. In each of these answers that you're expected from your case, you would be required to take a stand. You can't just not take a stance. For example, if it's asking, is this industry getting profitable? So the answer is yes or no, it's not, or yes, it is, right? So you want to take a clear stand. Like in real life, there will always going to be uncertainties. There will be points which are heavily supporting one argument versus the other. So look through data, look through evidence, and then take a clear stand and back your reasoning as to why your decision makes sense based on the data. So that's the other key point. You want to take a clear stand, but you want to take it based on evidence and based on data that's available in the case, not from something outside of the case. And you do that by sharing both sides of the arguments. Like, it shows that you've thought through both sides. In real life, there's no real good answer, but there is data and there is evidence that makes you take a stand. And then explain why what you're saying is important. And start with the most important point first. You don't want to have the most important point last. It really dilutes the level of your writing. So start with the most important point and say why you are saying this is the most important. So explain the why. And finally, instead of writing paragraphs and paragraphs with lots of data and numbers, it's best to create a visual or use a table or draw some sort of insight that supports your story with a visual, right? Don't just write lots of numbers and compare it across paragraphs. Instead, you could use 2 trend lines, or you could use 2 bar graphs next to each other. So create a visual, make your case write up even stronger. So those are the tips and best practices for writing cases. 3 basic tips, 3 intermediate tips, and 3 advanced tips. I would advise to create a checklist like this of your own and then get some input from the professors as to what are some of their recommendations, and then build a checklist. And before you submit, just go through this and say, hey, does it pass all this best practices? If not, how can I get better? What are some of the tips that you use in your case write-ups? I'd love to learn from you, and add them in the comments section below. Thanks.